What do people do? I'll tell you what they do, amongst other things. If you've got this secular utopianism, you've got the consumerist dumbed-down materialism, you've got the state fascism. What else did I say? That was it. Well, then, and you've got the religious fundamentalism as well. Some people respond, not with materialism, they respond with New Age paganism. And it's interesting to me how popular that is. Now, a lot of us, we don't operate in that world, but this is part of our secular society. The Green Movement, for example. I remember a man coming up to me after I preached in a church, and he said to me, are you some kind of communist? In fact, he said, are you some kind of tree-hugging communist? So, sorry, I just gave you the way of where he came from. and I said, why do you say that? Because I was preaching on Revelation. A time is coming when God will destroy those who destroy the earth. And I said, we have a responsibility as stewards. And he said, listen, it's all going to burn anyway. And I said, good. I'm glad you recognize that. I'm coming round to your house. I'm going to burn it down and steal your car. Because it's all going to burn anyway. No, you can't do that. I said, well, exactly. That's the point. Now, I do find it bizarre that in a lot of Christian magazines, you get people kind of, either being ridiculously green at one level, the Gaia God and so on, or being anti-environmental. But I understand a lot of people who are into kind of New Age paganism because they don't want the certainties of scientific, materialism. They don't want the control of the state. They reject totalitarian religion as being unspiritual. They want spirituality, but the last place they expect to get it is in the church. So what they do is they go to the old pagan religions. They appear attractive. After all, are they not close to nature? And so on. And again, you by the way, you get that infecting the church too. I was preaching at a church in the south of England, and they had a wee picnic afterwards, and I sat at this table. And why do I get these people? They must have been the only people in the church. Because this couple, who were very, very nice, an older couple, they said, David, would you like to join our group? We think you would love it. And I said, what's your group? And they said, we're Christian nudists. I said, no, you're kidding me. And then I had to stop laughing. I was biting my lip because they were so serious. I said, no, I'm sorry, I don't have the body for that. It was something else. But the other thing that New Age paganism works in well, because it fits in with the sexual philosophy of the age as well. And that's really quite interesting. And it does kind of sound quite tolerant. I did a debate in a mosque, which was fascinating, because this was how the university perceived religion in Britain today. In fact, they called it religion in Europe. They had a Muslim, they had me as a Christian, they had a Baha'i, and they had a pagan. And I loved it because the Baha'i was very sweet, and we dealt with that. The pagan really hadn't a clue. And I mean, with 150 Muslim men, I they were shouting hallelujah, whatever the Muslim equivalent is, and they came up to me afterwards, oh, you're so like a Muslim, it's just if it wasn't for Jesus. And I said, well, if it wasn't for Jesus, I would be like you, so I thank the Lord for Jesus. But it was the pagan. The pagan really fascinated me. A girl who grew up in a Catholic home. But paganism was about freedom, about worshipping nature. My answer to her was to say, listen, Mother Nature without the Father is cruel and will always disappoint you. And yet, there's a lot of people going that way and still. But this one is really important. The church, in my view, and I'm sorry, I'm sounding so negative in all this, but the church, in my view, has got this one so wrong that it's quite spectacular how wrong we've got it. Because we've been caught in this trap of a particular argument. Sexual confusion, dysfunctional families. What do I mean by that? Well, you need to go back. There's a particular philosophy. It's called queer theory. You go back to the sexual liberation of the 1960s. People genuinely did believe that we were sexually repressed, and if only we had sexual freedom, you could sleep with who you want and do whatever you want and you'd be happy. Sex is an appetite like food. So what do you do when you're hungry? You go to McDonald's, you go get a steak or whatever. What do you do when you've got sexual needs? Well, you just go and satisfy them in one way or another. Now, in reality, that has wreaked absolute havoc. I mean, I would argue, for me, the concern I have is it's wreaked absolute havoc in the poor housing estates around me. I mean, we had a guy recently who was charged with murder. He's got 14 children with 9 different women. Now, what bothers me is about the kids. What chance have these kids got? And what are they going to be doing? And I think that's one aspect of it. The historian Dermot McCulloch, who's an Anglican, had a series on the BBC. Now, the BBC would never give me a series, or anyone else with my views a series, called Sex and the Church. And what McCulloch does, and really, because he's really angry because he wasn't accepted as a homosexual priest, it's a real hatchet job. He basically, and he's actually a very, very good historian. He's got a great book on the Reformation, for example. But he teaches that before Christianity came along, the Greeks and the Romans and the pagans lived in sexual bliss. Like if Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Western Samoa, which is meant to be a classic sociological book. Now it's been totally destroyed because of her methodology and everything else. But nonetheless, for modern Western liberals, it was almost like a Bible. And a lot of modern sexual theory came out of that. And actually, if I wasn't a Christian, it would make a lot of sense at one level. Aldous Huxley, for example, said there was no way he could become a Christian because he wouldn't be allowed to indulge his sexual appetites. And I think actually there's some people who are like that. But McCulloch said, before Christianity came, sex was a pleasure. After it came, it was a sin. And now what's happening is that we're getting back to sex as being a pleasure and so on. Where I agree with him is we are going back to a Greco-Roman pagan view of the world. But the Greco-Roman pagan view of the world was where you had sex slaves, you had rampant sexual disease, you had men dominating women, you had a perverted, form of homosexuality in which boys especially were abused. You had endemic child abuse. You had a patriarchal society in which women were used as sex objects to sell things, and so on. Now, when you describe it like that, you say, well, wait a minute, that's happening in our culture. Why do I need to see a semi-naked woman striped over a car in order to persuade me to buy the car? What is the imagery about that? So that aspect, I think, is there. I don't think it's a progressive society. Now, let me come on to one of the issues, the big issues. The British Prime Minister, David Cameron, who's a Conservative Prime Minister, said that his biggest achievement was same-sex marriage. Now, that's astounding. I mean, to hear that statement being made at all. If you'd asked 20 years ago, would that ever be said by anybody, never mind a Conservative Prime Minister, he said, don't be daft. Well, why is it his biggest achievement for him? Because he's trying to show that the Conservative Party are a party of equality and caring for the poor and so on. And everything's been sown in the kind of sexual liberation basket. And actually, in Europe overall, capitalism has definitely won, and Marxist economics is out the window, and all the rest of it. And what you'll find is, even on the left, people are much more concerned about social liberal issues than they are about political economic issues. And that has enormous, enormous implications. And it has enormous implications for the church and how we deal with things. I got a letter from the Prime Minister's office when I was debating this saying, why shouldn't two people who love one another not be able to marry? And it was such an inane answer from a major government office. I wrote back to them and said, okay, I want to marry my son then. Two people who love one another. Oh, don't be ridiculous. Yes, but that's your definition. I decided right at the very beginning of this, I would go around as many groups as I could, not to Christian groups, but go to as many non-Christian groups as I could and talk about this and discuss it. And I remember going to Aberdeen, and the very few Christians turned up because they couldn't be bothered. They're not interested. And unless you're going to have a protest thing and, be an anti-gay thing, and I wasn't prepared to do that. So I just had this debate and this discussion. And I remember two of the gay people who were there, who were partners, they gave me a lift back to the station. And it was so funny because they said, David, you've changed our mind. I said, what do you mean? He says, we're against same-sex marriage now. He says, we're not going to get married because it's wrong. And I went, what? And they said, look, you made perfect sense in your case. And they said, what do you think about us? I said, guys, that's not really a fair question, but I said, I will talk to you about it. And they kept in touch. I think it's possible to present a biblical view without crushing people. I think it's got to be. And it doesn't have to go the other way. You don't have to patronize people and say, well, really, I agree with you. No, you don't. I say to people, look, I disagree with you on that thing. So the sexual confusion, I think, has also come into the churches. I have a friend in the Netherlands who's a social worker. You know what her job is? Her job is to go around the stricter branches of the Reformed churches dealing with the children who've been sexually abused within those churches. She's not some card-carrying liberal who wants to... But, how do we allow that kind of thing to go on? I think, again, the church has bought into the sexual dysfunctionality of the culture. Even people who... I remember a guy once at our General Assembly standing up and going on about women in tight trousers and stuff. And the old elder beside me just rather wisely said in his very broad Highland accent, oh, that boy's got some problems. And he did have some problems. Of course he had problems. This obsession that people have with these kind of things. And I think in our secular culture, it is actually a highly sexualized culture, which is an obsession with various aspects of sexual behavior. And it is creating confusion. And with the same-sex marriage stuff, people say, oh, that's out the way. No, it's not. Because the next thing that's coming is polygamy. And already, Netherlands, Germany, and Britain, the leader of the Green Party in Britain, refused to rule it out. I chaired a political meeting in which the SNP candidate refused to rule it out, on religious grounds, ironically. People should be free to do what they want. In my view, the transgender thing is massive, and it's massive not because I'm reluctant to say this in any kind of Christian gathering, because what Christians tend to do is go, oh, that's terrible, no, we need to deal with this, and we need to... And I'm saying, no, don't you understand, if you've ever met someone who's transgender, by definition almost, they are completely messed up, and more messed up than in other ways. And it's for me, that whole issue, Peter Tatchell, I debated Peter Tatchell, I found it really, really fascinating. I spoke to him afterwards, and I want to give you this quote because it's huge. This is really significant. Tatchell was totally against same-sex marriage, really against it. There's an article that he wrote in 2002 which hammered homosexuals for being for same-sex marriage. He turned it round. I said to him in public, Peter, I don't think you've changed your mind. I think you've always wanted to destroy marriage, and I think you think that same-sex marriage will do that. And he just smiled and he said, maybe. Overcoming homophobia, he says, will result in more people having gay sex but fewer people claiming gay identity. The medieval Catholic Church, despite all its obscurantism and intolerance, got one thing right. Homosexuality is not, it suggested, the special sin of a unique class of people, but a temptation to which any mortal might succumb. It now seems fairly certain in the light of modern research that most people are born with a sexual desire that is, to varying degrees, capable of both heterosexual and homosexual attraction. Now look what is happening here. Every single one of our main media presenters and politicians will tell you, and clergymen will tell you, people are born that way. That's what they'll tell you. Now, I actually think there is a genetic factor in homosexuality, but there is no gay gene, and what Tatchell is saying here is actually, it's much more radical. He's saying, no, actually, you're born with varying things, but most people will be able to choose. And the significance of that comes on. Once homophobia declines, we are bound to witness the emergence of a homosexuality that is quite different from the homosexuality we know today. With the strictures on queerness removed and same-sex relations normalized and accepted, more people will have gay sex, but paradoxically, less of them will identify as gay. 20 years ago, it would have been considered homophobic to deny the Kinsey report that 10% of men were homosexual. The last time a government attitude survey in Britain was done, it was 0.9%. You find far more people claiming to be bi, actually. And what that means is, it's very different. This is because in the absence of homophobia, the need to assert gayness becomes redundant. Gay identity is the product of anti-gay repression. When homosexuality is disparaged and victimized, gay people understandably feel they have to affirm their desires and lifestyle. Now that is true, by the way. That's why someone in a gay community sometimes has far stronger community than they might get in a Christian church. And don't disparage people if they talk of transphobic community, or for me, the drug community. I remember a guy who was coming off drugs and so on, and we put him to a house in Edinburgh, and he came back, and the guy who was in charge of the house said, Dave, you have to escort him everywhere. When he gets off that train, you're at the station, you do not let him out your sight at any point, even though he's professing faith. And I said, why? He said, you'll see. Well, I'm in the middle of Dundee city centre with this guy, and I couldn't believe it. Every street corner. Hey, Ralphie, how you doing? Hi, Ralphie. Oh, hey, Ralphie. Hey. I said, Ralphie, you all junkies? He said, yeah. He says, there's a huge community of us here. And it is a community. Now, you leave the community, you're ostracized. But it's a very powerful supportive network. It's a supportive network in destruction. But you see that in all kinds of groups. And I think that's why, again, the church needs to grasp that. Because for someone like Ralphie, coming to church once on a Sunday morning and go back to your home, that's useless. You're asking him to exchange a life in community for a life in isolation. And he's not going to do that. He's not going to be able to survive with it. Thatcher goes on. However, if prejudice is vanquished and if one's sexuality is not privileged over another, defining oneself as gay or straight will cease to be necessary and have no social significance. The need to maintain sexual differences and boundaries disappears with the demise of straight supremacism. Homosexuality as a separate, exclusive, clearly demarcated orientation identity will then begin to fade, as will its mirror opposite, heterosexuality. Instead, the vast majority of people will be open to the possibility of both open sex and same-sex relations. They won't feel the need to label themselves or others as gay or straight, because in a non-homophobic culture, no one will give a damn about who loves and lusts after who. That's a hugely important thing for people to grasp. And you've got to add on to that, now that gender is coming into this, there is going to be a movement, I predict, in which people will want to get rid of all forms of gender anyway. So pronouns like he and she, male and female toilets, and so on. Now people say, don't be ridiculous in that. I say, no, that's the way that we're going. But ministering in that kind of society and culture does not mean that Christians stand up and go, oh, this is terrible. You did not get the Apostle Paul marching down the streets of Corinth saying, with a big banner saying, down with this sort of thing. You know, you just didn't. What you did was you got them ministering to the broken and confused and hurt and messed up people. Even right, can you imagine Corinthians being written to a church nowadays? You've got somebody who's had their stepmother, who slept with their stepmother. This is how you ought to deal with it. And then the second letter is, okay, glad you did what I said, but you've done it too harshly, more or less. I'm paraphrasing hugely, but that is, I think, a decent understanding of it. Equality is another big, big and massive issue involved in all of that. Let me just get past the tangential. It's through there. Inequality. I came across an astonishing statistic. In the US, between 2013 and 2015, the wealth of the 14 richest Americans saw their wealth increase by $157 billion. That is more than is owed by the lowest 120 million. Now, again, you're not teaching communism or anything like that, but in a world where you have that level of inequality, you are going to have all kinds of problems, because unless you assume that the people who are really wealthy are all going to be really nice and just give it away and so on, they're going to use that money to buy power. They're going to use that money to buy influence. They're going to use that money to oppress people. I think the inequality in the culture overall, it's breathtaking. You get corporations like Google and Apple and PayPal and so on, who will wax lyrical about how they're concerned about social justice and, sexual equality and so on. And yet, Google in Britain take more government subsidies than they pay tax, and they're a multi-billion-pound corporation. Well, what's that doing? That's affecting people like a woman in my congregation who's on a disability allowance who's going to lose that. And I'm saying, stop, and in the church, in a sense, we've kind of, again, I think we bought into a lot of those sort of values. How many people in our churches, and I'm talking, about in Britain, people go, it's terrible, the poor who are scrounging. And that's true. It is terrible, people cheating on the tax system. And if only we dealt with it. And yet the British government paid out 85 billion in subsidies to corporations. They paid Disney £500 million to come and make films in Britain. Disney, a massive corporation who are going to make lots of money out of that. And that's taxpayers' money, and it's our money. And a lot of people look at it and they say, well, this is dreadful. And I find my particular struggle is having equality networks that have got nothing to do with equality. And having ambassadors that are coming from America and Britain and elsewhere, and Scotland now, who are traveling the world for LGBTI equality. But what about all the inequalities in other forms? I'm not arguing for homophobia or for the Putin's right of what he does or the ridiculous Nigerian laws. I'm not going to defend that. But I'm saying, why is it our politicians will put resources into that? The answer is because it costs them nothing. And as far as they're concerned, it's not an issue that affects things. And again, in the church, in that, living in a secular society, for me, means living in an unequal society and living a different kind. Now, I'm not saying we don't have wealthy people in the church. You will. But I'm saying that there should be no poor amongst us in the church, in the sense of, I'm thinking of a guy in our church who just lost his job and his family and all the rest of it. What do? We've got to try and help him. I have lots of things to say about the church, and the time's up in terms of the recording, so I'm going to leave it there, and then I'm going to ask myself a question. What about the church? And I'm going to answer that question before you go, and then you can ask me any questions that you want. If we're living in that world, what are we going to do? How are we going to be a witness? I don't like programs, but I was thinking of the phrase outreach, and I'm just thinking, there's something niggling me. So I want to suggest this to you. I'd actually quite like your feedback, because I haven't developed this at all. But I thought, no, we need more. So this is the way I thought about it. I'm just very simple, so this is a simple way for me. I think, first of all, we need outreach. And what I mean by that is we have to cry out to God. How long, O Lord, how long? And I think we have to pray in terms of conversion and church growth and so on. You know, I don't know. I looked through this. I wasn't sure how many seminars there are on prayer. That really bothers me in a lot of ways. And here's another thing. I remember a girl coming to see me, and she was saying her friend, male friend, had started watching gay porn and all this sort of thing. And said, she said, what can I do? I said, well, first of all, you've got to pray. I said, if you're going to confront him, do so. I said, but tell him to come and see me. And, we prayed together and so on. It's quite difficult to hate somebody you're praying with. Is it not almost impossible, actually? So I think prayer, isn't it interesting that we develop programs and so on, and then we ask God to bless our programs? Why not pray first and then see what happens? And if God gives you a burden, I remember, sometimes people get burdens because I feel that they've been manipulated in different ways. But I'm just so delighted if somebody comes and says, David, I really feel I ought to be doing this, and I say, well, how did you get that? You've been praying about it and so on. I said, okay, well, the next thing we'll do is we'll pray about it. But maybe you should test it. Maybe you should go out and get on with it. I read a marvelous wee book by Eric Alexander. In fact, I'd love to do this. I might go down to the bookstore and see how many books there are on prayer. My advice is read a good book on prayer every year. If you're a preacher, read a good book on preaching. But my advice would generally be, read a good book on prayer. If you want to do evangelism, read a good book on prayer every year. Read a good book on culture and society every year, trying to understand from different people's perspectives. Obviously continue reading your Bible. But Eric Alexander, in his book on prayer, says something that I've always known. It's a cliche, but I need to be reminded. You don't do prayer to support the work. Prayer is the work. And how on earth were they going to turn the Roman world upside down? So I think, the outreach is prayer. The next one I would suggest would be inreach in two ways. And one is really hard. Well, two are really hard. One is there's an inreach that goes on in myself, in my heart, and what's going on. And to pray the most dangerous prayer of all, Lord, show me my sin. If he does, you'll collapse. So he's very gracious, and he does it gradually. But to be able to see yourself as God really sees you is awesome and terrifying. but there's an in-reach. There's a work that needs to be done in my heart. So I can look and see other people's sins, but I have to ask, Lord, what about the racism in my heart? What about the fear of other people in my heart? Never mind homophobia, just phobia across. What about the arrogance and the pride and the self-aggrandizement and so on? But then there's another kind of in-reach, and that's within our churches. How can you have a church that does outreach if it doesn't do in-reach in the church itself? And I don't even mean discipleship. It's interesting how we break things into things. I'm thinking a lot of our churches, people actually need to hear the gospel, and it needs to work upon them. And again, I'll give two examples. For me, the most stunning was, there's two. I'm thinking of a woman who came to my church in the Highlands. I was telling Ruth about this lady who turned out was actually a man, used to be a rugby player. And I remember when I found out that she was really a he, and it was splashed, because she was involved in politics, it was splashed across the Daily Record, one of the major newspapers in Scotland, and I thought, I better meet with my elders, because these are, I don't mean this in a bad way, simple country guys, they're not, how are they going to be, all this, so let's talk about this and see what their reaction is. Well, they taught me a huge lesson, because they said to me, what's your problem? I said, well, this is obviously somebody who's really messed up, and so on. That's why we've got the gospel. I said, does this change anything? And Ross, the lorry driver, said, doesn't change a thing. She needs to hear the gospel. I said, well, what do we call her? He says, we call her what she wants. She wants to be called Sandra. We live with that. He says, I'm not God. I thought, okay, thank you. This is really, really good. I said, what happens when she becomes a member? He says, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. He says, this is a messed up person who needs the gospel, and she's no different from anybody else who comes to hear the gospel in this church. And I thought, okay, I'm very, very thankful for that attitude. And it was a huge thing to learn. A negative side, I was in a church, and they asked me to help organize an outreach program. I said, you've got 3,000 members. You live in an area which is 60% African American. The only one of your members that are black are students from overseas. You can't do this unless you're in a situation, if you're going to do outreach, you cannot go and do evangelism explosion and then tell them when they're converted, go to the black church. I couldn't do it, outreach and evangelism. People say, that's ridiculous, of course you can. No, it's ridiculous to expect you. How do you do outreach if you don't do in-reach amongst your own people? How will God bless that? Now, as I say, that's one particular issue. But there are lots of other issues. I mean, in my own congregation right now, we want to see new people coming because we want to see lots of people being converted, and we want to see the church grow, but the people we want to come are young millionaires who are old in years, who have got 11 children, but are both earning lots of money, and they've got plenty spare time to do Sunday school and do leadership and everything else. They don't exist. I've come to the conclusion that there's almost no normal people, at least in my ministry. I've never come, in that sense. And in fact, the people who come who are perceived to be normal, what we call the Little House on the Prairie families, who are absolutely perfect in their appearance and everything, you just know that deep down there's stuff running through. I mean, basically, there's a snake in the garden everywhere. And we have got to deal with that. So for me, gospel evangelism is the gospel in your own church and to your own heart. That's the in-reach. The other one, then you come to the outreach. And for me, the outreach is, back to the Sikh thing, the secular thing rather. You're aware of the concept of peak oil, that oil has reached a certain level. I'm wondering if we've reached the area of peak secularism. Jürgen Habermas and Charles Taylor actually, but both from different perspectives, talk about post-secular society. Habermas is fascinating because he thinks that people have had enough of modernism and they're looking for some kind of faith accommodation within a secular society. I'm not 100% convinced, but I do think this. I'm certain of this. In my own culture, in Scotland, people are more open to the gospel now than they've been in 25 years of ministry that I've experienced. But the church is less prepared to communicate it. that's the heartbreaker. Honestly, that's the heartbreaker. I'm prepared to say that's true for Western Europe. I don't know enough about Eastern Europe. But 15 years ago, in our international cafe, it was Malaysians and Chinese and Africans. 5 years ago, for the first time ever, we had more Germans than Chinese. There's an openness amongst many of Europe's people, young people. And one of the problems with the church is we aren't actually genuinely radical enough. We're not taking on people at these levels. And again, I'm sorry, going back to the sexuality issue, because that's the one I keep getting hammered on. This is true of, an hour and a half ago, just before I came down here. This guy contacted me who had been he still is a militant secularist at one level, but he wrote me personally about 2 months ago and saying, look, I'm backing off of this, Dave, because the way they treat you is horrible. And he said, I'm beginning to have a lot of doubts about a lot of this stuff. So I thought, well, that's nice, I'll let it go. An hour and a half ago, he contacted me and said, can you contact me immediately, please? I'm about to do a radio show. I'm a lawyer. I'm going to be talking about LGBT rights and discrimination. He said, I would like your perspective, please. And I said, you're kidding. When do you want it? He said, can you do it now? I said, I'm going out in 15 minutes. And I messaged him and said, send me the question. So I said, look, I'll do this, but when I come back to Scotland, can we meet up? And he said, okay, we'll do it. Now, here's the interesting thing, you see. Because Christians go, no, you're not nice enough. You're coming across as homophobic and so on. This guy is saying, no, you actually care, you believe what you're saying and you really care about it and you're willing to meet with me. And I think that's the key thing. Not about being nice. Now, maybe I'm doing self-justification, all right? Maybe I'm not a nice person and I'm justifying myself. But I do think that in outreach, we've got to be prepared to reach out to people. And we've got to be careful how we do it too. Imagine you're standing at the side of a river and there's people floating down the river. Does yelling at them stop them hurtling towards the end? No, it doesn't. You've got to find some way to be involved and to rescue them. I do think an awful lot of what we're doing as well, which really frustrates me, is that people are sitting around in luxury chairs, smoking cigars, if you like, drinking the wine and going, oh, isn't the world going to hell? That's like sitting on the Titanic and thinking that. Or worse still, having got onto the lifeboat, observing the Titanic going down, saying, isn't that terrible? I can't. But I see it, and it guts me. We're commanded to tell the good news, yet we so often want to keep it to ourselves. I find that people who have just been converted from a non-Christian background, you never have to tell them to evangelize. They don't even know what evangelism is. They just naturally do it. Because you're going to go back and tell someone, aren't you? You can't help it. I mean, it's... I remember one time I thought, we're beginning to make an impact in this community. And I'll tell you how I knew that. Because I was standing at a bus stop and I heard 4 young girls talking about what church do you go to and what's it like this. And they actually started talking about me. They didn't see me. And they started talking about the church. But unashamedly, in public, they were talking about Jesus to one another. Now, other people in that bus queue heard that. That would freak them out far more than having somebody at the street corner yelling at them. My son, I didn't necessarily agree with this because I was quite Sabbatarian at the time. My son used to go with a couple of his friends for a bacon roll and a coffee before the Sunday morning service in a local cafe with their Bibles and sit and read them and pray together. They weren't doing it to be a witness, but they were a witness. That's what we want. In Glasgow and in Dundee, actually, they used to have these things called laundrettes. And, still there's some. And they called them steamies. But if you're in a laundrette, they didn't have TVs in them. You just got the washing machine, which is quite boring to watch, really. Time's up, so I'll finish this. And so what do? You just talk to people beside you, because you're sitting watching a laundrette. So they use this phrase, the talk of the steamy. What are people talking about in the steamy? And my ambition is that the gospel is the talk of the steamy. That people want to reach out and want to find... in that sense, evangelism's got to be part of the DNA of congregations. Don't target people. Who knows who God will lead you to? I know one church in a working class area in Dundee that a Chinese guy came because he Googled Dundee because he was coming to work in the Michelin tire factory. And when he Googled Dundee, this church's website for some reason came up. So he thought, I've been to church, I'll go. And he was converted. He started taking other Chinese. This working class, with no Chinese living in the actual area, ended up with a congregation of 30 Chinese. It's fantastic. Who knows who God will bring you into your church? So it's got to be part of the DNA. And the last thing in that, because my time has gone, is you reach up, you reach in, you reach out, and you reach down. And the down is not patronizing. It's not I'm up here and I'm going to. But we are starving people who found a feast. And all we're trying to do is hand it out to other people. And I think that means the mercy ministries and everything else that goes along, Christians Against Poverty, all those kind of things as well.